got a couple big stories that are going to be highly relevant, I think, for the upcoming gubernatorial race down in Texas. One is a new poll to kind of show where things are at between incumbent Governor Greg Abbott and the Democratic challenger, Beto O'Rourke. If you want to tell us a little bit about what that poll found.
Yeah, we have a couple polls, it's like 2 or 3 of them that came out recently in that race. The first one, which was I believe it was the Texas Tribune and the University of Texas at Tyler, they found that Abbott now has an 11-point lead over O'Rourke, which is just a point off from his biggest lead in that poll to date, back from even before O'Rourke won the nomination. So, and it's, an expansion of his lead from the last poll. It's not a huge expansion. I think it's about a 1-point expansion, but it did bring the Real Clear Politics average for the race up to, I think it was like 7.8. So significant lead for Abbott going, into the home stretch here. We're almost at October, which is, of course, the last real campaigning month of the year. We still have another week until then, but it is an important indicator in the race that this is not really getting any closer, despite Beto O'Rourke's focus on gun control policies. He's stuck with that focus. He's really still emphasizing the need for more gun restrictions in his mind, and that has been really a central point of his campaign. It's obviously not the only thing that he's running on, and I don't know that the race is. Abbott wants to focus the race on things like immigration, of course, but O'Rourke has tried to keep guns at the top of mind for Texas voters, and it just hasn't really worked out for him so far.
Yeah, no, I think that's the key. We've been talking about this for at least a year now, about now that he's running statewide in Texas again, will he or won't he stick with his gun control message? Obviously, it's, I guess, popular knowledge would suggest that that's tough sledding in a state like Texas. But as you point out, he's stuck with it through the campaign trail. He's flip-flopped a bit, but in terms of his exact position, but he's generally hit that issue pretty hard. And as you said, it's not really paying dividends, it looks like, at least in the polling.
Right. I mean, he has changed his tact, I will say, obviously. He doesn't talk as much about his confiscation plan. He's gone back and forth on that, like you mentioned. He's obviously very well known for saying he wants to take everyone's AR-15s and AK-47s. It's one of the reasons this race is particularly interesting for us, right? I mean, Texas is, or at least the saying, or maybe the delusion, I don't know at this point, is that Texas is trending bluer over the years, and somebody like Beto O'Rourke has, a possibility of flipping the state that has traditionally been a Republican stronghold. That's sort of the big idea that going into this race, and has been for a while with O'Rourke, even though he's continually lost these campaigns despite a lot of outside help, a lot of excitement from around the country in Democratic areas for his campaigns. But the other big reason is that there's a huge stark contrast between O'Rourke and Abbott on gun policy, right? I mean, O'Rourke is one of the furthest left of any major candidate across the country. Like, he really literally wants to confiscate people's firearms. It's not a theoretical thing. He has said so very definitively. Now he's backtracked on that, and then gone back and doubled down on it, and then backtracked and doubled down. His campaign website still says that he doesn't believe anyone should be able to own AR-15s and AK-47s. But his message on guns doesn't focus on that anymore. It focuses on, he spent a lot of time focusing on this idea that Greg Abbott should call a special session to look at new gun restrictions, specifically banning anyone under the age of 21 from owning AR-15s and AK-47s and other firearms, under the sort of assault weapons banner. And so he's tried to shift to that point. Abbott has said that that's not constitutional. given some of the recent rulings on restricting firearms rights of 18 to 20-year-olds, which Abbott is correct. There have been federal courts have been trending against that in recent years in a couple of cases, as we've covered. But the polling indicates that people in Texas are open to that policy more so than they are to banning or confiscating AR-15s. We had another poll this week that showed a majority of Texans oppose an assault weapons ban. And so, it's sort of another poll in that vein of evidence that the assault weapons ban is becoming less and less popular in the United States. Certainly Texas is a little more gun rights favorable than a lot of other states, but it's still interesting to see that. And it's perhaps one of the reasons why Beto is not doing quite so well.
I was just going to say, I think that possibly speaks to why Abbott's lead might be growing slightly. As you said, it's only a point or two, but it's still growing, while around the country you're seeing these races where, a few months ago we thought there's this red wave, there's this talk of this red wave, and you're starting to see a lot of those races narrow. And in some cases, in swing races, you're starting to see a little bit of a Democratic edge. So I think that is interesting that while that's going on in a state that, the wisdom that's been talking in DC that, Texas is turning blue, Texas is going to turn blue. Well, you're starting to see it spread apart the other way, where the Republican is still retaining and even gaining on his advantage. And as you said, that Siena College poll that found a majority of Texans oppose an assault weapons ban, I think that at least plays some part in that. I think it's safe to say. Yeah,
I think so. Interestingly, the Texas Tribune poll found, I think it was like 53% support for mandatory buyback. So, and obviously, a lot of Texas polls are not that divergent from national polling. Now, obviously, that Texas Tribune poll asks about mandatory buyback of assault-style weapons. It doesn't none of these polls give a definition for what they mean by assault weapon or assault-style weapon, and these are obviously nebulous terms, as we've talked about a lot in the past. But certainly, they apply to at least ARs and AKs, but generally, while definitions vary significantly from state to state, in assault weapons ban statutes, they certainly cover a lot more than ARs and AKs. But either way, that language between banning assault weapons in the Siena poll and a mandatory program of buybacks from current owners in the Tribune poll might also cause a little bit of variation there, because maybe people don't, laymen might not understand what a buyback is.
Right.
Hopefully people would understand mandatory buyback means you don't have an option and it's confiscation essentially, but that might explain some of the difference. Also, there's what does banning mean? That could mean confiscation as well in theory.
True.
Usually people mean it to say no new sales. But again, these pollsters don't provide any definitions to the people they're asking these questions from. So, there's a little bit of ambiguity that goes on with some of these results. But I do think that, there's certainly evidence in the polling that Texans want stricter gun laws, or at least they say they do. And so that should open up. And Beto's policies that he's put forward aren't, wildly unpopular in these polls.
Sure.
So there ought to be more space for him to gain on this issue, but the polling indicates it's not what's happening. I believe there was a third poll, I believe, that we covered.
Oh, yeah, the Dallas Morning News, I believe.
Yeah, the Morning News poll, which found, and I might be mixing up some of these, so make sure you go over the reload and
read the
actually
piece.
Read the piece. But it's a lot of polls, and it's a lot of University of Texas involved in like every one of these polls for whatever reason. But they found that Abbott and O'Rourke are tied on who Texans believe would handle gun violence better. So he's not really gaining an advantage. And then, of course, multiple polls also found that guns are not a top priority for voters, even in Texas, where you had the Uvalde shooting happen. It's still ranking fifth in one poll and sixth in another poll as far as, top issues in the race that are influencing people's votes. So that's probably a big reason why he's not gaining a lot of ground, sure. Even though he might be taking the positions that Texans say they agree with more often in the polling. It's also something that's not really motivating people, and they're not really sure of him, it seems like.
Yeah.
Even if he's saying policies, he's supporting policies that they say they agree with. Maybe they don't trust him in particular. I don't know. It's interesting.
That's sort of a phenomenon we've covered in the past too, sort of the disconnect between polling that suggests people support something pretty strongly, and then when push comes to shove and a vote needs to be cast on it, it doesn't always work out the same way that the polls suggest. We've seen that with ballot referendum, for example, in various states on gun control measures. So it's quite possible that's what's going on here as well. Yeah.
That's the thing about polling is like, you gotta, it's not necessarily that the poll is skewed or done wrong. Obviously, polling is not an exact science. There's a bit of art to it. So, you're not necessarily going to predict everything perfectly or line up perfectly with reality. But it's more an issue of like, just because somebody says something in a poll doesn't necessarily mean that that's their top priority or that they even necessarily understand the question, or that it's going to motivate them to vote a certain way. And so, you got to examine these polls with the proper context. And, I think if you look at the breadth of the polling on this race right now, it says that while people might have a generalized desire for more gun control because perhaps they think it'll help prevent things like Uvalde in the future, they're not that sure about it. They're not that committed to voting off of it, and they don't necessarily trust Beto O'Rourke to carry it out the way that they'd like to see done. We'll continue to follow that race. And I think it's going to be one of those hallmark races for how gun politics plays out, because it's also one of the areas where you have a major race that does have guns as a top issue, where that's not really true so far in a lot of these other races. Although Everytown did just buy a $1 million ad campaign in Wisconsin against Senator Ron Johnson, the Republican there. So, we're getting into that period where we're going to see election spending really explode. And so we'll be on top of that as well and start to cover some of these other races and how they're playing out in terms of gun politics. Because there's just been so much that's happened since the last election that really affects gun politics that it's not really clear how things are going to work out. I mean, you had record gun sales for 2 years in a row with millions of new gun owners who are from demographics that are not traditionally Republican voters necessarily. You had the Supreme Court's Bruin decision, which has massive implications for gun laws throughout the country. But you also had things like the Uvalde shooting, right? It was one of the worst shootings in American history. And you had the House pass the assault weapons ban the first time in 30 years. There's a lot that's going on that we need to wait and see how it's going to play out politically.